universal sparks, and you think you know it all, but you wonder where is so much more than I could ever know. Your love is deeper than this world will ever show. And all of life's beauty shines around this moment now. The sky and the cliffs, they seem to change my life somehow. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, I will never be the same, never be the same ever again. Well, here I am waiting, Lord, my life is just for you. Please unfold all the plans that you would have me do. And if all the world's just a breath and nothing's here to stay, then all of the love we feel will save us anyway. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. I will never be the same, will never be the same ever again.
Hello, it's SDAQ&A time. Good to have you all here watching. And today we will be revisiting Season 2, Episode 10, my interview with Lyell Heise. So if you're listening on the podcast, this voice right now is coming to you, if you're going in sequence, 2025, but soon we'll be going back to 2020 and listening to my interview with Lyell Heise, Pastor Dr. Lyell Heise. And it's a fascinating conversation as we talk about all things Glacier View and Desmond Ford and the impact of Glacier View and the ongoing impact. You know, as I've been watching these interviews, you know, because each week I'm replaying one or two. We're going to be doing number 11 tomorrow. I think that might be, let's have a look. I think it might be Harry Ballas. And that's a fascinating interview. Let's have a quick look. Yes, so I'm going to try and get Harry on the program. And I've also asked Lyall to join us as well. He's on holiday at the moment. And so he may or may not be able to access the link. So sit back. I've got a nice brew here. I think it might be a cappuccino. And it's great to have you all here watching with me this week. Without further ado, is it without further ado or without further ado? Let me show my ignorance. Let's go back in time and watch my interview with Dr. Lyell Heise 5 years ago. So just give me a second, Lyall, to press the buttons down here. I've got a little monitor that I can now see what people are writing, and some people have sent in some questions. So just give me a second to set that up. And just a couple more seconds to let some people join the group. And then I'll officially start. But things have been going really well. This is interview number 10.
Uh-huh.
And I'm going to have to buy myself a new seat because it's getting quite uncomfortable. I never get a backache, but until just sitting on this seat, it's supposed to be a good one. But yeah. Anyway, that's enough small talk.
Giving you a hard time.
So we'll just wait till there's about 10 people in the room. SDAQ&A, I'll just let people know that are joining. That is a podcast, and recently, in the last 3 weeks, we've gone live as well from our Facebook group, and all the interviews will find their way onto the podcast as well. And this is a special series we're doing on the Glacier View 40th anniversary, and it, of course, when that series is finished, and Jill herself is going to be chatting to us as the last person when that series finishes. But yeah, afterwards we're going to continue on talking about all things Adventism. Okay, so I think we've got enough people there. I'll make a start. Welcome to SDAQ&A. I'm Peter Dixon, your host for today, and I'm joined by Dr. Lyell Heise. How are you, Lyall?
Oh, look, I'm fine, Peter. We've been looking forward to this for a while.
Yes.
And I'm really glad to be honoured to be on your list. I don't know what you have to do to get on your list. I'm glad I'm on it.
In fact, you were one of the first people I tried to talk to, but we kept crossing paths, didn't we, with different appointments and meetings and whatnot. I've been loving your live piano not performances, what would you say, sharings?
Yes.
They have been really beautiful. What kind of inspired you to do that?
Well, we got to COVID and it suddenly struck me that we had to reinvent a lot of the ways we do spiritual life together. And I began to think to myself, I think we've got an opportunity here. This is not really a minus. And so I started out by asking people their favourite hymns and working away in my little YouTube channel. I had an inactive one, but it's pretty active now. And I can make little videos and just post them on Facebook. And I got I'd get 100, 150 views. And so then last Sabbath, I just thought to myself, I wonder what happens if I just turn on Facebook Live and start playing the piano. And it actually blew me away. It's a comment on what people are doing on Sabbath afternoon. They're hanging out on Facebook, and probably more so because of the virus. But I got to 100 views, and it got up to 350 views, I think.
Incredible.
So,
yeah, I remember watching it. What I love about it is you can see people clicking the love heart if they're especially moved by something, the upcoming
yeah,
love hearts on the side.
yeah.
It was, I love your playing. In fact, we used to live next door to you in Linfield Avenue.
Linfield Avenue. They were the
days. And not far from where we are right now. And I remember you doing me a wonderful kindness, which I'll just share with everyone. As I said, we were neighbours, and I'd made my very first recording on cassette with Trevor Magnuson. He and I had used his 4-track reel-to-reel TEAC or something that his mother had used and bought to make the Mag Reels series.
Yeah.
And so we just had a bit of fun and recorded it in my lounge room there in Linfield Avenue, and actually right where I'm sitting right now. In Chapman's old house in there, Trevor was living in the shed apartment.
Yeah.
And isn't that funny? That just clicked right where I'm sitting right now is where we recorded probably half that cassette, and the rest was in Linfield Avenue. Anyway, long story short, before I started selling any copies, and I sold 60, and I hope that they're all hidden away or lost or somewhere. I don't want people to hear it now. But I remember asking you to take a listen, and you literally, instead of just taking the cassette, you said, yeah, let's listen to it now. And you came into our kitchen lounge room area there in the house in Linfield Avenue, and I pressed play, and you listened to the whole thing right through, and we'd pause after each song, and you'd give me your critique and comments and thoughts, and it really encouraged me. Actually, that was my very first foray into kind of putting my music out there into the
Out
world,
there. Mm.
and so I really appreciate that. And I've kind of always seen you as a kindly person and a very talented musician, and someone that has got the pastoral care part of your ministry in good form as well. So it's a real pleasure to have you here today, and we'll kick straight into some Glacier View. We've been sidetracked a couple of times in our last two interviews, which is great. I shouldn't say sidetracked. We've been delving deeper into surrounding issues.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I'm just wanting today to pull it back to start with on Glacier View. Can you remember?
I better have a drink before
Have a
we.
drink. Well, what's interesting, that cassette I would have played you in about 1981, and we're talking about August 80.
80, yeah.
Can you remember where you were exactly that day that you found out that Des had been defrocked, and how you felt about it?
Peter, I can remember the exact day. I'll need to do a little context for you. I've been really fortunate. Every job I've had, I've always described at the time as the best job I've ever had. Well, the best job I ever had at that stage was head of theological education at Fulton College in Fiji. And we went out there in 78. We were there 78, 79, and 80. And I loved that job, and finished up being involved in the life and ministry of a whole bunch of people who are now very significant leaders around the Pacific. I always give myself a little pat on the back about that. Des had been a guest speaker at a week of prayer at Fulton before I got there. So I wasn't there when he did that ministry, but it was hugely appreciated. And so the name Des Ford always rang very nicely tuned bells in the minds of Fulton staff members who had the memory of him coming there. So early in 1980, when there's a kerfuffle, no, it was 79, wasn't it? The 79 was the forum in PUC. The kerfuffle developed pretty quickly after that. Guess who got to be the bunny at Fulton College, who had to explain to all these pretty much adoring faculty members that the person they loved seemed to be making waves or seemed to be in deep trouble. And Pastor Heise, what do we make out of this?
Fascinating.
So I got to be the maker of the story to them, and I tried to present the story with a proper, and it was only a breaking story then. It wasn't a full-blown tragedy. It was, there's something's happened, and there's meetings, and there's study, and there's people talking, and there's going to be a big conference later in 1980.
And you heard the tape, of course, of the forum. Yeah.
So the principal at the time asked me to actually talk to the staff several times in staff meetings during the year about what this all signified. The principal wasn't a pastor or a theologian, and deferred to me to kind of make sense out of it. So in sharing with them, I tried to explain how, in my view, and the view of, I think, any decent theological educator they were going to get, Adventism was a dynamic movement. It wasn't static. It had a tradition of fine-tuning things as it went along. It was in the Reformation tradition. It was open to new insights. And that this guy, Dr. Ford, who they loved, had some really good insights to present in a really important area of Adventist understanding, which was about eschatology and about the climax of the great controversy, how that plays out, what are the Bible images that illustrate it, how do we understand them, how do we interpret them, and that he had some good ideas to offer. I was pretty unabashed in saying I thought the ideas about moving on from literal sanctuary in heaven to a much more philosophical understanding of what the gospel means and how it plays out in the experience of a believer. I thought these developments were good. I didn't rubbish 1844 to them. And in fact, I don't think Des rubbished it either, really. I think what he was anxious to point out was that a very literalistic reading of this prophetic scenario was full of difficulties. And if we had a better framework in which to think about gospel and sanctuary and eschatology, we could avoid some really bad pitfalls that we had and could and would fall into. Anyway, so that's how I set up the scenario, and the principal was happy with that, and the staff were happy. And I, at the time, was offering an optimistic vision for Glacier View, thinking that they would get to something like the consensus statement, sign off on it, and all go home. And that's what I think most of the scholars hoped for, and certainly what Des hoped for. This is a long way to get to your question, but
I don't mind at all. That's the point of this series, is to unpack it at leisure.
Yeah, well, we're getting there. You've lived in the Pacific, Peter.
Yes, Fiji, been to Fulton, New Guinea.
So come mid-1980, a wretched little mosquito, I think it had to be, because it turned out to be dengue fever, little mosquito bit Lyall, and Lyall sank into the worst health crisis of in fact, my whole life. I thought I was going to die.
Wow.
Dengue fever is a wretched thing. It feels like you've gone through the ringer of one of those old washing machines where they had two, and you feel like you've been through it. And I felt like that. I remember one night in the middle of the night, Gayleen talked to our next door neighbour, Don Roy, and Don had a high-ace van, and Gayleen said, look, Lyall's not good. We've got to get him to hospital. So I lay down in this Toyota high-ace van, like in the aisle between the seats, like a little minibus it is. Got down to Suva.
Well, the road from Fulton to Suva was terrible back in those days.
Yep.
We did it a few times in the early 70s, and it was dangerous.
Yeah, well, this was 80, and it wasn't much better.
Yeah.
It's nice now. It's sealed now. So this was bad. They couldn't do much for me in Suva. I came home again with an injection of penicillin from a blunt needle. That was it. So I got worse and worse, and finally they decided they had to ship me out of there and get me to Australia and to the Sydney Adventist Hospital, which was one of my favourite places. I'd been a chaplain and public relations director there. I loved the thought of being consigned to that place. So I remember getting on a jumbo jet. They booked a couple of seats, I think. I laid back anyway. I was prone on the thing, and bless his heart, Graham Chester, my friend, jumped on board to be an associate because they didn't quite know how I was going to function. So I flew in feet first on a jumbo jet, and an ambulance came to Sydney Airport. And we're getting close to October. I want you to get the feel of
this is
the
quite dramatic
and the psychological vibe here. So yeah, I get into the sand, and because it's a tropical disease, with all due respects, they were a bit fox-eyed as well. So I forget actually how long I was there, but I think it was 6 or 7 weeks. Wow. So I was glad to be a servant of the SPD and be a member of ACA Health Fund. So I'm there, and it's coming up toward October, and it was absolutely incredible, the buzz around the hospital. It wasn't conducive to peace and health and recovery.
Wow.
I've got a bunch of pastoral colleagues all around Sydney who are all coming to visit me, and that was back in the days before email, really. And so it was photocopied faxes. So everybody's got a take on Glacier View.
Wow.
It's coming up, it's close. There's this document, there's that document, it's faxed, it's photocopied 10 times. And I had a pile of them beside my bed, like about this high. And I was trying to recover. I was feeling a bit more stressful the closer this was getting. It looked like they'd really upped the stakes. And the rumour mill and the anxiety mill, of course, amplified it a bit more than it might have been realistically the case. So I remember I had a young friend who was a pastor in Sydney, and he would come and visit me nearly every day, and his photocopier was just getting white hot. And so it wasn't, I felt fairly fearful and still a bit feverish and well and truly off my oats as we got to the actual event itself. And the photocopiers and the verbal reports, even during Glacier View, were running wild between Avondale and Sydney and all my mates and the Sand. Yeah, so when the word came through, sort of the first real, rather than that consensus statement being the climax of the thing, which would have been actually, I think, very helpful.
Yeah,
the
that
real
would have
climax,
changed Adventist history, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the real climax turned out to be that illegal after the event meeting, and Des on the line and looks like he's going to get fired. And at that point, I wondered which was worse, that or dengue fever. So I was in hospital, to answer your question, trying to recover from dengue fever when that hit the fan.
Wow. And in many ways, you were at the hub there, because the Sand is just across the road from 148.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Yeah. There's another interesting angle on it,
yeah.
Which is, as I was trying to recover, and shortly after that, I'm still sort of in the Sand, a little bit mobile, trying to recover, I had no job. And the reason I had no job was I'd accepted a call in mid-1980 to go to Heidelberg to teach theology there in South Africa, and already swapped notes with Jeff Garn. You remember him?
Yes.
Jeff was coming from South Africa to Australia. And so he and I did some deals about swapping money and cars and furniture, and we got a fair way down the track. But it became obvious once I got into the Sand, I wasn't going to be a fit candidate to go to Heidelberg. So that folded. So there I was, sick in the Sand, no job, pretty distressed about Glacier View, and wondering what in the world was going to happen next. That was the year that Lawrence Turner was coming to Avondale. And so Ron Taylor at the division, in an attempt to snag the Lawrence Turner deal, had been told by the Brits they wouldn't let Lawrence go unless there was a swap. So I think Ron Taylor felt me among the more dispensable souls under his benign gaze. I'm pretty sure that was his take on me. So I drew the short straw as being the sacrificial lamb to get Lawrence Turner to Avondale. So I politely declined that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's when you
that was when Avondale
yeah,
was at long last getting a pastor.
yeah.
I think the Avondale people had prevailed on a really genial and much loved conference president called David Curry, that they should make this appointment. Avondale should have a pastor.
Mm.
And would you believe David Curry was my very first supervisor in ministry back in Dunedin in 1970.
Mm.
So 10 years later, Dave Curry tapped me on the shoulder finally at the very end of that year to ask me if I'd come to Avondale. I don't think he had that call as an easy passage through the hierarchy.
Mm.
There were some objections at several levels on the way up, but Dave...
Because of your thoughts and maybe
Yeah, it was...
agreement with Des Ford?
my family name was what seemed to be problematical. I don't think anybody had anything in writing or verbally or anything from me about controversial theology, but maybe I just looked suspicious, Peter.
Now, your father was quite supportive of Des Ford.
Yeah, indeed.
Vern, is that right?
Yeah.
My memory right? What was his take on this?
He paid a very significant price for that too, which is why I think Dave Curry on round 2 with the next Heise, he was very supportive of my dad.
Right.
And very supportive of me. Yeah, my dad, bit of interesting history for you. My dad had only a primary school education. In the middle of the Depression, had to leave school and go chopping firewood to help support the family. There were 10 kids in the family. Wendy Marks's mum was one of them.
Yes, she mentioned last night in our chat.
So my dad was one of the older males. So that's what you do. You grab the axe and head for the family wood cutting business.
Mm.
He talks about twice having a college principal, a Pastor Rosendahl, in the 30s, mid-30s, come to Queensland recruiting students for Avondale and finding my dad and his brother in a recently burnt out forest cutting down firewood. So they were stripped to the waist, lots of ash and fire remnants all over them. They're just teenage boys. And this guy knelt down in the paddock with them and prayed for them and prayed that God would bless their lives and give their lives direction and think about Avondale. Mm-hmm. And he did it not once, but twice. It really affects me every time I think about that story, because that's probably why I'm sitting here.
Yeah.
So yeah, my dad and his brother finally got to work, earned some money with Sanitarium in Brisbane, came to Avondale. Dad was there 6 years, and that was because he had no high school education. So he spent the first 2 or 3 rectifying that, and then did the full-on ministerial course, graduated with Russell Crans and Ray Stanley and a bunch of luminaries. They were friends all their lives.
Yeah.
So Dad, with a bit of a shaky start to education, was voracious reader and was just absolutely determined to fulfill his call to ministry, to be well informed. Early in his ministry, he got to read some books being published by a fellow called Lewis F. Weir. Ring a bell, that one?
Yeah, well, I think I just noticed Glenn Weir watching. Are they related?
I don't think so.
Right, but
no.
That name definitely rings a bell. And someone the other night was speaking of them as well.
And I need to tell you about this guy because he's a profound place in Adventist theological history. He was a pastor who, back in the late 30s and early 40s, began to lament that Adventist eschatology, prophetic scenarios, and so on were a little bit like what Ellen White described Adventism is in 1888, dry as the hills of Gilboa. Um, and Lewis Weir was of that opinion and searched for ways to create a Christological approach to that was the center and core of Adventist theology anyway, but it's easy to lose touch with that. So he rectified that, made sure that Adventist theology in his preaching and evangelism was truly Christocentric, and that eschatology was the same. At the time, we had a bunch of prophetic interpretations emerging largely from Uriah Smith, really hotted up by attempts to contextualize them all in World War I, where Turkey's a player. And so you've got this Turkey, King of the North stuff, which was all emerging in the Adventist scenario because it was current. And there's a nice thing about Adventist shots at prophetic interpretation. They've tried to be current, but that's a trap if you think that prophecy is all about politics and not about core gospel business. And you can easily get derailed and read the newspaper and think you've got the prophecy sussed. Well, that was Uriah Smith's, I think, mistake. And it was the mistake of many Adventist evangelists in World War I when they hung all this together. So Lewis Weir was, of course, after World War I and into World War II, and it started to happen again. And Weir, in essence, says, let's take a deep breath, folks. Let's stay a fully Christian and Christ-centered organization in theology, in prophecy, and the whole works.
What year was this?
This is in the early 40s through the late 40s. It's got a bit of a sad ending here, but we'll get back to my dad. Weir was greatly loved, began to write all kinds of books to illustrate his points. But I want you to imagine a scenario where there's a whole tradition of Adventist evangelism that's been hooked on Turkey and very, very literalistic sort of prophetic interpretation, newspaper type analogies. And Lewis Weir comes up with a real gospel emphasis. The knives come out. And Weir was given a very hard time, and finally, I think disgracefully, set up to look as though he had committed an indiscretion and was drummed out of the ministry.
Really?
But it wasn't true.
Well, that's a very important part of the puzzle.
It is, and I'll tell you why it's important for several reasons. The first reason is personal. My dad loved these Lewis Weir books, and early in his ministry, in a conference I won't name, he got a package which was a package of books, which was coming. Weir lived in Victoria. And it was a little conference. The conference president was there. Oh, what you got there, Vern? And Dad says, oh, this fantastic stuff. Lewis Weir's writing really engaging stuff that really carries our message and our impact forward. Well, not wise acknowledgement. And so at the end of the year, Dad's ordination's on the table, but no, says the president, he's reading this suspect material. I think we better let it sit for a year or two and see how this Vern Heise pans out. Yeah.
Wow. So that the books were around the 40s. When would that have occurred?
My dad's ordination was somewhere. He went to this conference in 1945. It would have been sort of by about 50, I suppose, or 51, somewhere in there.
Would that the writings of Weir influenced the committee, Frida, that came together for questions on doctrine? Like, was there a move in the church for some changes
Look, it's an interesting thing. I haven't drawn the lines between Weir and questions on doctrine, but I was going to pursue your question by telling you some other lines.
Yes.
Um, Guess what? Adventist theology lecturer at Avondale was a devout and avid reader of Lewis F. Weir.
I can guess.
You can guess. But let me tell you another thing, and this is the funniest thing of all. You've heard of the name Hans LaRondelle. And Hans LaRondelle, in his time at the seminary, sadly he's dead now, but he became, I think, the definitive voice of a Christological approach to Adventist eschatology, prophecy, the righteousness by faith thing. He was greatly loved. And LaRondelle was called out to Avondale to run a year-end summer school. And I think this would have been sometime in the late 70s, perhaps. My dad was still working as a pastor and went down, loved the thought of getting a chance to do some study with LaRondelle. He gets down there, there's 200 or 300 pastors there. And guess what books LaRondelle prescribes that you've got to read? Not only, it's not optional, these are the textbooks for this course in righteousness by faith.
Wow.
They are the books of Lewis F. Weir, from whose widow LaRondelle got the rights and republished them himself for years until
I was going to
he died.
say they obviously wouldn't have been available via the church
No,
bookshops anymore.
no. So LaRondelle got the rights, republished them, and they were textbooks for an Andrews University seminary class.
Did they have to keep that a little bit under the radar?
No, LaRondelle didn't think so, and people in Australia at the time, ministers of Dad's ilk, did some heavy breathing, some with joy, some with dismay. But the younger types from my age on, I only knew about this because of my family connections. The name was otherwise unknown. And LaRondelle just presented him as a really thoughtful Australian evangelist and theologian whose stuff was so good it had to be read for this course.
Wow. So are those books still available now?
I think so. I think you can Google them and find them.
Yeah. If anyone's watching that's good at doing that kind of thing, maybe they could provide a link for us below.
Yeah.
That is fascinating because that kind, and Norm Young mentioned this the other night, that there were many people, I think he even mentioned Weir, but there were many people expressing this desire to bring Christ back as the focus, which
Yeah.
is kind of what Ellen White was saying in 1888.
Anyway, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So my dad always loved to be on the front end of developments in Adventist
yeah,
theology, and that really, I think, energized his ministry and made it really effective.
yeah,
And it was a fairly natural follow-on as Des achieved significant impact in the church. Dad really enjoyed that as well, and became a very close and firm friend of Des, and was, of course, really distressed when things went bad.
mm,
And it made it hard because he was unafraid to share his appreciation for Des and to share the gospel in the way that Des had modeled. And toward the end of his life, he came upon some really hard times, actually retired early, which gave him a longer retirement and a more peaceful retirement. And we were glad about that in the long run.
Just a little aside there. Your dad and I were actually good friends, even though we're a big age difference, because he was one of the few people that I ran into that actually knew my grandfather, my mum's dad,
Oh, McFarlane.
Fergus
Yes,
McFarlane.
yes.
And he, sadly had his life cut short at about the age of 36. but your dad knew him well. I think in
Yeah,
Adelaide they worked together.
yeah,
And so I remember several times having some wonderful conversations with
yeah,
your dad about his memories of my grandfather.
yeah.
Do you think at that time, the post Glacier view, with people like yourself and your dad and many, many others that were more supportive of Des and upset about what had happened, was there pressure for you guys to kind of pull your head in and be quiet, or did you feel you could speak freely but only to certain people?
Um, Let me think about that. The context that I'm trying to go back and re-immerse myself in is the context of me recovering from dengue fever, Dave Curry trusting me with that. It was a very important appointment, that Avondale church pastorate, and for Dave to trust me with that, I took as a badge of honour. Um, but I should explain to you that it was not an easy assignment. You imagine, you, well, you don't have to imagine. You lived there, you were there.
Yeah,
The,
81 was my first year.
the Avondale of the early 1980s is the Avondale that loves the gospel, that has been through a significant energized revival, I would think it's fair to say, in the 70s. It has a bunch of among the best educated Adventist academics in Australia, or at least the biggest collection of them. There were others in other tertiary places, but this was the church place. Some of them had been recruited there by Des. Some of them had had their first awakening to the power of the gospel through Des. There's critical mass of them there, and all of a sudden, the whole church structure seems to be saying that's a dead end, and we're not going there, and we're not going to employ people who go there. And I turn up as pastor to this bunch of people that very, like in January after the October, here I am.
Mm.
So that's not an easy assignment.
Well, Avondale was, and I mean it in a good way, a bit of a bubble because I was there 81, took a couple of years off, but taught music there in the 2 years that I was taking off, and graduated in 85. And those 5 or 6 years were really exciting, vibrant. There was a really good atmosphere. You built the church,
Yep, yep,
and there was just a really great feeling that was like lots of creativity was happening. There was music and arts and conversation. It was
yeah,
I don't think anyone that was at Avondale, like I literally was living not on the campus but in town and spending every day there from 1981 to 85.
yeah,
It was just a really good atmosphere there, and
yeah,
you contributed to that. There didn't seem to. I didn't really become aware of all the controversy until more the early 90s.
yeah. Well, that's a testimony, I think, to the spiritual maturity of staff members, many of whom were bitterly disappointed, but who could say, as I had to say, Peter, in my deepest, innermost being, I think a massive injustice has been done here. I think there's unplowed territory theologically that, until it's plowed, is going to leave us with a bit of a permanent limp as a denomination. But there's so much good here, and there's so much of value that even through our tears, we're going to soldier on. And we're going to try not to cry in front of of sensitive, not quite grown up students who we want to love the gospel and we want to love this church. So we're going to go at this with as much energy as we've got from one day to the
Mm.
next, and that's what we did.
Well, I had zero fearful Adventism taught to me during that period, and
Mm.
And so thank you to you guys. And hopefully when I went out, and particularly in the early 90s, a bunch of us started presenting that kind of gospel that we'd
That's
been
true.
shown, we passed that on as well.
Yeah.
There was a bit of a rise in the late 80s, where the concerned brethren, we talked a lot about this last night. You'll have to go back and watch that interview.
Oh,
It
yes.
was fascinating talking to Peter Marks and to Wendy and to Ruth Ellen about Raglan and the concerned brethren
Yeah, yeah.
movement. They started to get a bit of a foothold in the late 80s to some degree, and then continued to rise from there. When after Des had passed, um, and the college was going to do a memorial service on their grounds there, um, there's an interesting kind of story there where sadly they were told that that wasn't to happen.
Yeah.
Do you think that this nice bubble, again, I don't refer to that in a sense of it being naive or anything like that, but this beautiful environment that was created at Avondale, and I think replicated in Andrews and some other places around the world, do you think, did you pause and think, hang on, this is under threat now because of the move of the memorial service to another location?
Yeah, I think I did. Um, that was my worst day of the last decade because I was actually the MC of that
Yeah.
program, and and Ray Roenfeld, who was college president, had navigated it very carefully and thoughtfully and honestly and openly. There was no subterfuge. It was, it, from our end, it was clear, thoughtful, and the deliberations of the college powers were frank, open, and honest, and a decision was made that we should go ahead. But external forces prevailed, and that decision was actually overturned. That was a low moment. I've got
Mm.
no good way of I can't window dress that experience.
No. Um, do you think the people that had the power to shut that down have direct links back through to the concerned brethren from the
No,
standard
no,
to
no, I
Standish
don't believe that
Brothers?
at all. I've got enormous respect for the people on the college board and for division leadership who are a new generation of people who I think, Peter, don't have as much residual pain from the 80s as some of us older silver-haired baby boomers.
Mm.
So there has been a passing of the generation.
Mm.
So I didn't detect, no, there was no, I don't think there was any malice or vindictiveness. I think it was it was trying to manage the troops. And some of the troops were very restless. And
Restless,
I would have
which
hoped that,
side do you mean? The restless that it was going to go ahead on
yes, yes.
Adventist soil?
Oh, yeah.
So who was restless?
Well, well,
So I'm just trying to draw a connection to the
there
concerned
was a
brethren
significant cluster of restless souls in North New South Wales.
opposed to opposed to the memorial being on college
Yes,
soil.
yes.
I've just got a theory that that cluster of people have links to other people who have links to Heartland, who have links to Standish Brothers, who have links to the concerned brethren.
Look, I wouldn't know about personal links. There's some philosophical links, maybe a similar worldview.
I mean, links that I have back to Des Ford, even if I'd never met him, via chatting to people that supported him and by knowing lecturers at Avondale and by meeting pastors like yourself. There's a thread that runs back that would give me my own theological leanings based on a definite thread that goes back to a loosely organised movement, people that supported Des White and other more progressive views.
Hmm.
That's the kind of link I'm talking about. The
Yeah,
Standish Brothers started Heartland. They had people that studied and trained there. They went out and started their own ministries. Those people started other ministries. Those ministries are the ones that fought against Des being on Adventist soil, the memorial.
Maybe, yeah.
You see it more organic, though, whereas I see it perhaps a little bit more of a political manoeuvring.
Yeah. I it's hard to yeah, it's hard to be really definitive about who's linked to who and in what sense are they linked.
Mm.
Um,
It just strikes me that the more conservative body that are wanting to bring back a pre-QOD, pre-Weir kind of Adventist environment are actually organised and are more politically motivated and have a focus, and they're monetized, and
yeah,
they get behind, they put their money behind independent ministries.
yeah, that's certainly true.
And so I just feel that the people that ensured that Des Memorial wouldn't happen on Adventist soil were connected with this movement that is here to bring back their version
Mm,
of the church. What you mentioned earlier that when you spoke to the teachers at Fulton, you were wanting to convey that Adventism does embrace the change and has demonstrated that over time. I think nestled in the Great Controversy, which is still published and presented and has been since its very first printing, is a kind of a defined statement of what the investigative judgment is and what the
yeah,
judgment is about. And
yeah,
even though Ross Cole pointed out the other night that the investigative judgment wasn't officially set up till about 1850, the loose beliefs that were under its eventual defined belief were formed soon after this appointment, October 22, 1844. And that definition of the investigative judgment, as I said, was nestled into the Great Controversy book. And Ellen White, and I read this. This was an open letter. If you go back and watch the last interview that Raglan Marx sent out in 1987, and I hope it just springs out to me. He was saying that Ellen White didn't just say it was a pillar or a cornerstone, but the investigative judgment was the very foundation and central pillar of Adventism.
okay.
So what I'm saying is that yes, things ebb and flow and change, and we've had different views on the Trinity, and the judgment has kind of been given a bit of a polish from time to time with people like Wagner and Jones and Ellen White herself, and the 1919 conference, where the minutes went missing. People are wanting to kind of infuse Christ into this investigative judgment doctrine, but people will still come back to a perhaps more legalistic view of the investigative judgment. So I'm interested in your thoughts on, in your opinion, has that evolved and changed? Whenever it is evolving and changing, does it get sort of suppressed and stopped? And what do you think the investigative judgment actually is saying now and then?
Mm. Oh, okay. No stress here, Lyall. Just take.
If I was smarter, I would have articulated that a lot better, but I think you get the gist of what I
Yeah,
mean.
yeah. I think the Great Controversy chapter by Ellen White has turned out to really define what they were saying at that time. I think it's very important to realize that among Ellen White's literary, the streams that flowed into Ellen White's literary work there really go strongly back to Uriah Smith. So yeah, she endorsed them, but the Uriah Smith approach to theology and prophecy became standard fare in the Adventist church. And I think you can make a good case that Ellen White drank from the Uriah Smith stream. Now, having said that, what have we said? Nothing particularly new. I don't think any an analyst of Ellen White these days would deny the fact that she read widely, used sources widely. She was a great compiler. She had people in her employ who, in fact, compiled her.
Fanny Bolton.
She didn't sit down and write a book from beginning to end very often, if ever. So that she's got a mind that's reaching out for material, for frameworks, for sources. She uses them, but the dynamic impact of her work, I think, if we take the New Testament doctrine of prophetic gifts seriously, is not a prodigious literary output. It's a dynamic, interactive, face-to-face leadership in the community where she's working. So that her gift to limit her gift to a massive rainbow patchwork literary output is, I think, a failure to understand what the New Testament's describing when it's describing what it means to be a prophetic leader in a church. So I'm only going through all of that to say I refuse to have my theological and my hermeneutical frameworks constrained by someone who is a rainbow warrior, literary patchwork, whose best work is done by looking narky guys in the eye, staring them down on occasion, running from them when she needs to get a break, and coming to Australia. Now, the literary stuff is really interesting. It's important in defining how we got to where we are. But if we claim to be Protestant and then in the same breath say we can't do any other interpretation of sanctuary theology than this heavily Uriah Smith impacted chapter in Great Controversy, we've got to shut down as Protestants, Peter. It's a myth that we can't maintain.
Well, if you're saying to these lecturers and future leaders at Fulton that there is progress and we should be able to put some of these things she said aside and go back to the Bible, why isn't that reflected in future releases of the Great Controversy? And at what point did she water down her view that the investigative judgment was not only the cornerstone, but the main thing, the main pillar of Adventism, the central pillar? Why wasn't that reflected in future releases by the church if they are open to this progress and Bible being sola scriptura?
Yeah, well, we've got a bunch of human beings, haven't we? We don't have the 24 elders that sit around the throne in heaven aren't on the General Conference Committee, Peter.
But doesn't that make it hard as a pastor to be saying, I want to bring this knowledge and learning to people, but the guys that are releasing the books aren't reflecting that change?
Yeah, it does.
Because that then makes your claim of us being a Protestant movement under jeopardy if it's not changing.
Well, that's what Walter Martin struggled with, didn't he, for 40 or 50 years?
Yeah.
I was going to tell you an interesting thing, probably maybe now.
Yeah.
I was at La Sierra as senior pastor there when Walter Martin was handing over the baton to Kenneth Samples.
Yes.
And and Walter Martin already was distressed. He was quite a fundamentalist, Peter.
Mm.
He's not a knight in shining armor of progressive contemporary
I know.
theology.
No, I know.
So he looked at Adventism through his very narrow spectacles. He wanted to hear a very specific thing about gospel, which he thought he was beginning to hear. He wanted to hear a very specific thing about Bible and Bible interpretation, couldn't quite hear it, and so began to write off the Loma Linda Adventist theologians as hopelessly liberal. He wanted to hear a certain something about our relationship to Ellen White, thought he could hear that, and so lived in limbo land for a while. But when he was passing the baton on to Kenneth Samples, thought he'd have another round table with representatives of these Adventists that all seemed to have wax noses, and he couldn't actually nail them down.
Yeah.
So he called a meeting, and would you believe, I got a chair at the meeting.
Really?
So here's Walter Martin and Kenneth Samples, new boy on the block,
Yeah.
looking at us all slightly glassy-eyed.
Who else was there?
Well, here's a bunch of the Loma Linda theologians who I will grant you were reading from a different hermeneutical page than Walter Martin by quite a degree, but to my view were excellent Adventist theologians. So there's the Jack Provencher, the Graham Maxwells, the Richard Rices, other names that you might have heard who were in theology at Loma Linda. And at La Sierra, there's a Bailey Gillespie and an Ed Zackerson. Who else? John Jones. Lyell Heise gets a seat. I'm not sure why, but anyway, there I was.
Yeah.
So this was all post-Paxton, post-Glacier view. Yeah.
Because Kenneth Samples, we interviewed him the other night, and he on this series. Did you get a chance to see that?
No, I knew that you were, but I
Yeah,
just couldn't get to it, and I thought
You'll
I
have
was
to
going
watch
to.
it. You'll have to watch it. It's really, really interesting. In fact, I think he has now joined our group, so he might be able to be tagged if there's anyone wanting to ask him some more questions. But back to that idea of the investigative judgment, I'm just trying to pin down what is this definition. We've got the definition in the Great Controversy, still proudly released and promoted by the Adventist mainstream church today. It must be frustrating if you want to see a progressive move with Adventism that you feel is happening and is there amongst certain people, to not see it reflected in
Well, I'll tell you
promotion of the mainstream body.
I'll tell you where it is reflected. It's reflected in the 28 fundamentals. You cannot read that statement on the sanctuary. It used to be 23, it's now 24, I think.
Yeah, 20. Yeah. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
You cannot read that without seeing something's happened between the last edition of Great Controversy and that statement.
Okay, you don't have it handy there, do you?
I don't, but it doesn't use the word investigative judgment.
But is that because there's a move? So I see a move by Ted Wilson and his cohorts to bring us back to the Great Controversy version of it. And I
I
see
think so.
I see a move by a lot of administrators to water it down as much as possible in the fundamentals so that it lessens any kind of controversy amongst the grassroots people. And then I see a lot of grassroots people just responding with, oh, see, it says here, it's quite clear that it's just about a judgment. And it becomes very nebulous in recent editions of the
Yeah, which I think
fundamentals.
is the appropriate stance to take. I
It,
don't think the literalism and the angst
mm,
and the scenario, which is almost or could be seen as anti-gospel in the original Smith formulation,
I
is
agree.
not going to cut it, Peter.
No, I agree. And I'm all for the more recent versions of the 28 fundamentals, apart from the adjustments just recently made. But
Mm.
on that topic anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
But how frustrating that the very top tiers of leadership are wanting to bring it back to the great controversy version.
Yeah, but look, be pragmatic for just a moment. You've worked across a variety of cultures. I have too. Invested a lot of effort in cross-cultural ministry. And as I look at the Adventist Church, it's a dynamic movement, 25 million people around the world. I want you to guess, because that's all we can do,
Mm.
a number of that 25 million who could give you a Uriah Smith Bible study on the investigative judgment.
None could, but they could give you a version that says we need to be sinless to get into heaven. And the very desire, the very purpose of the sole mission of Adventism is to prepare us to be ready for Jesus, and to be ready for Jesus requires us to keep the commandments and to keep the Sabbath, and it just spins off. So they wouldn't be able to articulate the subtleties of the Uriah Smith infusion, but they would definitely get a sense of an older version of Adventism to a more progressive version of Adventism, and they would support the older version, and they would see the progressives as being dangerous.
Yeah, but I seriously think that in the sociology of Adventism, these massive people movements, even in Africa, which I think we stereotype it as being very conservative, but I think the Adventism of Africa would certainly be focused on the African experience and African issues. The same would be true in Asia, in South America, and wherever. Certainly in the way that Adventism is presented in the West when it engages young adults, and it doesn't do it as well as we would like, but we shouldn't be pessimistic. It does it better than a lot of us think. And in the communication of the Adventist hope and ethos, the sort of thing that kept me awake as a kid, worrying about whether my name's come up in the judgment, I don't think those nightmares are occurring.
No, Ruth Ellen mentioned that in the interview last night, that she wasn't ever had that kind of thing happen. And I don't think, in fact, I think if you were watching 3ABN and getting Adventist theology from that, I don't think you'd go to bed having nightmares either.
No.
I think there's a great move by all facets and factions of Adventism that infuse Jesus and love and in positive ways. In fact, the more I kind of drill down on people that are on all different sides of Adventism, the more that's coming across, that is the main thrust. Even Ted Wilson, his main thrust is Jesus and the imminent return of Christ.
I did have something I made some notes about something I wanted to talk to you about, and that is, what is the essence of the apocalyptic vision? It's very important that we get this straight as Adventists, because some of us think one thing's the essence, but I'm going to argue against that. The idea of apocalyptic, that is, that the great controversy is careering toward a climax sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm.
That is first century Christianity. The last days have arrived. That's the book of Hebrews. In these last days, God has spoken to us by his Son. And New Testament Christianity is apocalyptic. So to be motivated about Jesus is coming back again, the conflict is narrowing and intensifying. That is core Christianity.
And you can see the conflict in the Gospels.
Yeah. So when Adventism Miller got some of that, he overlaid it with another thing I'm going to argue about, but he got the essence right. And early Adventism as an apocalyptic movement is a fantastic restatement and re-energizing of first century Christianity. But the essence is the orientation to Jesus and to the fact that he wins in the great controversy. The essence is not the mathematics or the geography. And Adventists have got into deep trouble on the maths and the geography. We got into trouble with the geography when we read the Bible backwards and said we're going to create something in heaven that's beautifully done because it's just as nice as what we made on earth when we made a tent in the wilderness. It's getting the cart well and truly before the horse. So this whole thing about apartments and here or there, that's geography, and it's not the essence of apocalyptic.
And it's metaphorical.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to argue is that you can be a passionate Adventist if you get the essence of the apocalyptic, even if you're nervous or dismissive of the geography or, Peter, the mathematics. Now, that's tricky, but I'm going to go there because I think it's just as true. And when William Miller had all this tied to a time period in 1844, did you know he had 15 ways of proving it?
Yeah, and I think he had 20 dates, and I don't think he even came up with the October 22 one. That was snow.
Until he got really troubled when it wasn't panning out the way he wanted.
Yeah.
So all I'm saying there is I don't think that even his calculation about 1844 for Adventists is the essence of what it means to be a New Testament apocalyptic movement. And that's why I think the current generation of thoughtful Adventists can be as passionate, as much as or more than me, and still be willing to have very thoughtful, non-ultimate conversations about geography and mathematics. It's possible to go easy on the maths and retain the essence. In fact, we're not fully Christian unless we retain the essence of an apocalyptic hope. And that's relevant in the age of coronavirus, and it's more relevant than Miller's maths or Uriah Smith's heavenly geography.
I agree, 100%. I think what concerns me is there is a move to have anyone that thinks like you're just suggesting you're thinking to not be in the Adventist church.
Yeah, I refuse to let other people define my Adventism. I absolutely refuse.
So how do you feel about Ted Wilson's compliance document, which is trying to do just that?
Well, yeah, what's he trying to... the compliance thing that's about Adventist policy. That was the women's ordination thing is the
Women's
main...
ordination, gay stuff to do with the 6,000-year Earth. There's, I think, 5 or 6...
Oh, that's right.
And already 6 unions have been warned. The next step is reprimand. The next step is sanctions. The next step is union leaders and conference presidents being a little bit more cautious of what they say. The next step is grassroots local church being affected. And it's policy. It's like there was this moment, one of the saddest moments I've watched on Adventist, where I've watched heaps of stuff on YouTube, where Jan Paulsen is at the recent Autumn Council. In his 2 minutes, he gets to speak on his thoughts on the compliance document, and he's begging Ted Wilson and the committee to not go down this path. He's getting tearful. He's wound up at the end of his 2 minutes, and Ted Wilson says, well, you guys all voted for it. And I thought, mate, you lobbied for that vote to get through. And it's passed on, okay, over to mic number 5. The reason Jan Paulsen is upset, the reason Dan Jackson is upset and calls it hooey, is because they see the ramifications of it trickling down to the grassroots people.
And I'm
concerned about people who have the view you have that are younger than you when they start getting pressure in 2 or 3 years' time? Or do you think it's not going to happen? I mean, it's already
Um,
happened and
yeah,
happening, but do you
yeah.
think it's going to be headed off at the pass?
I I think ad, the Adventist um, the Adventist tribe has many more Jan Paulsons and Dan Jacksons than Ted Wilson wants to believe. And 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 should we get to a situation where those heavy prescriptions are demanded of all regions of the church and punitive methods underway, I think it will be the end of Adventism.
But it's happening. It's the
No, it's not. Well, it's no, it's
warnings.
not.
The warnings have been given.
Yeah, but
Two were
what?
reprimanded, and it was brought back from a reprimand to a warning.
Yes, sure. But where's it gone from there?
Well, it's now they've got their next amount of time to think about it and to come into line. And if they don't, it's going to be reprimands. And
Okay.
if they don't come into line after that, it's going to be sanctions.
Yeah. Well, if it gets to that, Peter, and that prevails across the board, um, I'm going to refuse to let that define my Adventism just as strongly then as now. But I don't believe it
Yeah.
will. I think this present situation is a bit of a cliffhanger, but I've got more faith in human nature than to think that's going to be the prevailing ethos.
I've got
Look, we've been mercifully blessed by an extension of a year to the next General Conference, which I hope results in different leadership. Um, and I just don't. They went to the precipice with that. I sat and watched that whole annual council
mm,
and all those votes. I was dismayed.
yeah, the
And you
Tuesday night one's the one to watch if people are wanting to look that up.
and you can't tell me that that is going to define the interactive ethos of a dynamic movement like ours. I just refuse to believe that it's can go the whole hog.
And look, have do and will always feel that I'm super impressed with your stance on that. It has inspired me. In fact, it kept me in the church. People like yourself, with that real positivity and the ability to bring it back to the human condition that surely sees a better future and kindness and putting Christ center and that kind of thing. I'm just more dismayed in that I don't think, practically speaking, things are being done. Now, when I spoke to William Johnson, and I was just super impressed that he spoke with us for this series. If he's watching this, I'm just so grateful. He had such a wonderful way of talking about all the issues that I raised. And he said that, like you, he feels it's not going to come to that. We've come to the edge of the cliff, but it's not going to go over the cliff. And I don't know why, but I feel less positive. And I
We
don't
want to get
mean
the ambulances all down at the bottom as quickly as we can, Peter.
and I don't mean that I'm not a negative person. I'm just saying that if you want that to not go over the cliff, what's being done to stop it going over the cliff? Now, Pastor Johnson alluded to the fact that the PUC, I think, and maybe the North American division, he alluded to it, so I'm not wanting to put words into his mouth, but that they carry a lot of the financial contributions that are given to the GC, and maybe when they decide not to give as much as they do, because they're only required to give a way lesser amount, maybe that's their trump card to bring it back from the cliff. But I'd be, if I was them and I had my finger on the finances, I would have been doing that before Autumn Council and soon after. But I can't see any evidence of any action being taken to stop this compliance document catastrophe.
Mm.
Are you aware of stuff I'm not?
No, I'm not a prophet, but I just think already I've noticed in Spectrum reports that the fact that they do GC meetings by Zoom now has actually improved the input from the members. And they're forced to do electronic voting, no matter how much the powers might have not wanted it at San Antonio. They're forced to do it now. So electronic voting, more capacity to talk in electronic meetings, a GC that's way wound down. There's no like 60,000 cheering saints.
Yeah.
I've been there in a worship experience is really lovely. But several thousand booing when Jan Paulsen gets up to talk is appalling.
But that's the time to withdraw the money. When Jan Paulsen was booed.
Yeah. But there's no booing possible while ever we're doing electronic GCs.
Why do you think some of those that could have didn't speak up as strongly? Like Dan Jackson, I just keep watching that video where he calls at Hui over and over again because it's such a courageous moment. Why aren't more of the division leaders and union leaders around the world speaking with such confidence?
Look, I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I think it's uncharitable to just write them off as though they're timid or though they're scared about their jobs or whatever. Look,
no, I'm not doing that.
No, you're not. But plenty of people do. I don't think that's fair. I'm aware of some pretty highly placed church leaders that I talk to significant amount who say that they're really in it for the long haul, and there's nothing to be gained by strident confrontation. They reckon that processes still work, and distance from Washington DC works, and so it's a complex story. Overlaying all of that is the fact that we are a spiritual community who want to be together and want this gig to succeed. So it's not we're not just a subsidiary business arm who's sick and tired of headquarters and wants to poke them in the eye.
In fact, the culmination of our conversation last night with Peter and Wendy and Ruth Ellen was the word togetherness. That there's a beautiful thing about Adventists that they love togetherness.
Yeah.
And you and I have both spent times doing worship music for all kinds of Adventists and experienced the beautiful togetherness with the more conservative, with liberals, with leaders. It's difficult for me to talk about because I have so much love for the leaders, for the grassroots, for the left and right. I do just feel that even though our focus is not on political things, for the sake of our children, there needs to be a little bit more action from those who desire the compliance document to not go ahead.
Yeah, I think I agree with you when it's all boiled down. Yep.
Wilson, speaking in a sermon that serves as his annual World Pastoral Address, said that the devil's tactics include ecumenism, charismatic worship approaches, and attacks on biblical prophetic understanding. And he said he had felt the blows personally, I'm just quoting now, in recent weeks with the death of a prematurely born grandson and the discovery that 2 other grandsons suffer serious health problems. So he is saying that to go against these documents that he feels people should comply to is actually causing the devil to make attacks on him personally. And he lists one of those things as charismatic worship approaches. And I think, boy, that's a big call to say that if you're using contemporary charismatic worship styles, that you are bringing the devil's tactics into play against people. You and I have been very involved with worship styles that could be miscalled charismatic, but they're more just people wanting a sacred, divine, devotional connection. What are your thoughts on that general statement and how it applies to your continued work in worship music?
Yeah. So the devil's weapons include ecumenism, charismatic worship, whatever that is. Um,
Yeah.
um,
See, at the moment, it doesn't seem too bad because you can define it many ways. But who gets to be on this compliance document committee? Who gets to decide what's going to be on it in future? Who gets to decide that later on we're going to call charismatic worship approach anything that involves a major seventh chord? Like
mm,
who stops this craziness?
yeah. Ah, Peter, what to say? All of the things that he's discussed are evil in the eyes of the beholder, but none of them, as I can see it, are essentially and of themselves evil. Like ecumenism, in its best sense, is something that I absolutely applaud and long for. A sense of mutual respect, and we're in it together. In fact, Adventist mission, when it first got going around the world, developed a policy statement that's still in the GC policy book. And it's about our relationship to other denominations. And it's brilliantly written. And it must be over 100 years old now, or just about, more maybe. It's about how we all servants of Christ, how we value one another, how we need to work and uphold each other. Because the ecumenical thing really hits when Christians are out to make pagans Christians, but they've got several different brands in the field. That's when it becomes really urgent to figure out what sort of ecumenical stance are we going to take here. I remember my missiology lecturer at Andrews, who was Gottfried Oosterwall, who was Mr. Adventist Mission. He used to pull that thing out and quote it to us all the time. It was the one GC policy of which he was tremendously proud. So I don't know what's worrying Ted.
Well, I mean, I've just listed three with the worship styles, the prophetic attack on prophecy, the ecumenism. He's listed in the compliance document as women's ordination. I think that's the first one. And then later on, there's one where the leaders will have to comply in believing the earth is only 6,000 years old, which is not even a salvation issue.
No.
That's a compliance issue.
Mm.
I just see a train heading towards the end of the line and careening off unless something's done. But so let's go to women's ordination. The devil's obviously using tactics against Ted Wilson personally.
So
He believes
does
because
Ted
of
are you paraphrasing him, or does he actually
so
say that
well
that
he
that the devil is at work with something to do with women? I didn't hear that in
no
what.
no that wasn't the women's one there. He was in that quote. He was talking about only those three things, but I'm then extrapolating, which is a bit dangerous. But it's very clear that one of the compliance document orders is that
Is
women
in
should not be
connection.
ordained.
Yeah,
So I'm just saying that if he's as passionate against charismatic worship approaches, women's ordination is included in that list, although it's not quoted there.
yeah. I think the thing that's got us in a spasm about the women's ordination is twofold. There's one area of the conversation which has to do with what does the Bible say about this, but Ted's got himself into a corner in terms of what does the church say about it, and what are the rules that we've set up, and what do we do when people break the rules. So
Yeah,
the latest spasm is about rule breaking. It's not about should women be pastors, or even should they be ordained. It's what do
exactly.
we do with naughty people who break the rules.
Yeah. And,
So
and that's why the women's ordination thing is more of it's just a symbol of what's
yes,
really going on.
yeah,
But but my point is, who gets to decide the rules? And is there anything like being done to kind of to to politically fight back? I had a very interesting chat with someone working at the union, and they said, "Oh, you know, you're banging on about this stuff, and what you don't realise is that's just the tip of the iceberg. We've got stuff going on behind the scenes that is going to really help to pull this back, as you say, from the edge of the cliff." And I pushed back on that. I said, "Well, just tell me one thing. Tell me one thing you're doing. One thing. I won't tell a soul. Just tell me one thing you're doing." And after a few days of me not letting it go, he finally said, "Look, okay, there isn't anything really, but I just feel that we love Jesus. We surely the progress won't go backwards."
Okay.
And I just thought, I don't know.
Well, let's talk about the women's front, and let's talk about, if you want to think about practical, what are we doing? I'll give you a little case study.
Mm-hmm.
It may not be fully satisfying, Peter, but let me try. Back in about the year 2000, we, the pastors and theology teachers at Avondale, became traumatized by the fact that we were taking $10,000 a year from a bunch of really capable women, and we had a feeling in the pit of our guts that they probably weren't going to get jobs, and sure enough, they weren't getting jobs. So here we were, being very gender inclusive. We were having these women come, taking their money and watching them go off in despair or pain. One woman, Peter, in the 80s, when I was here as a pastor, a student actually committed suicide. It was a complex deal. There were relationships that were tricky for her, but seriously, I knew her really well. And at the bottom of that woman's soul was a notion that, I think God's called me to this, but where am I going to get? Am I going to get anywhere?
Mm.
So come early 2000s, a few of us got together and said, we can't put up with this. We're not going to put up with this. And so we formed a little trust. We called it Women in Ministry. We had really good relationships with the division as we did this, but the one thing they balked at, they wouldn't let us call ourselves Women in Adventist Ministry. And we had to be incorporated because we were going to raise money and offer tax deductions. So we had to, because of that, we had to ask them about the title Adventist. They didn't have the courage for that, but they had the courage for everything else that I'm about to tell you. So we were independent, but pretty much all employed at Avondale or friends of Avondale. So we started to raise some money, and we said, what we're going to do is help these women get jobs. So we're going to talk to conference presidents and say, we realize you're in a bind. You've only got X dollars to hire pastors. You want every hire to be successful. You're not sure if the women can be, not because you don't like them, but because you don't know what's going to happen to them when they get there. So you'd be scared to spend the money, really? What if we raised half the money and said, we'll give you half the cost of employing a pastor for 2 years if you will put them on a track toward permanent employment? And so that's what we did. We went out and raised I was the main fundraiser. In fact, I think I was the only fundraiser. We raised the money. The record went wild. Some people saying, how fantastic. Other people saying, you've sold theological integrity down the river for 40 pieces. One guy said, for 40 pieces of silver. Well, that was fascinating. If he'd read the Gospels, he would have seen it was 30, but he wanted us to be spending 40. And the presidents were we wrote to them all before we even started to raise the money. We said, we're not raising tithe. We're not going to deal with individuals. We're only going to deal with you. If you want to hire a woman pastor, talk to us and we'll do a deal with you. But we're not going to talk to local churches or mount political activism. We said, we're just going to deal with you. And so a few brave presidents got going, and we got going on that for a few years until very quickly, Peter, I reckon it was a tipping point, and we got going so that presidents hired women at the same rate that they hire men. And
Wow.
to this day, they do that. There's no, I don't detect any gender bias in the hiring practices in the church. I'm only telling you this to say, in this part of the world where we work and live, there's an attitude change that I can document over the last 20 years that prevails to this day.
And I hope I'm not sounding like I'm criticizing you or even 90% of people I know. If there were 1,000 Lyell Heises, this church would be, a better place. I'm in no way am I criticizing your work or things you've done. You've just gone above and beyond your job description to help people in all these areas, and that's so good to hear what you're saying there. That you can demonstrate the changes that have actually happened.
And I do need to finish the story, Peter, right down to this year, because I can't just answer your question, which is a 2020 question, with a 2001 initiative. So we raised the money, the women got jobs, we didn't have to spend any more money on conferences employing women. So we started to spend it on resourcing women for peer development. We sent 10 women off to a pastors' conference in North America. We've run 3 or 4 pastors' conferences here. And this very year, there was another pastors' conference for women on the calendar. And the division came up with the money. The people organising it wondered if they'd have enough. We said, we'll underwrite it if you go into debt. But they ran a good conference. The division paid all the money. They didn't go into debt. We didn't have to underwrite them. And even as we speak, there's a database being developed to nurture and communicate with and encourage these women pastors. Now that is a very significant initiative. I don't know what Ted Wilson would say about it if he knew it was happening. He'd probably be fine. I don't know. And it's true that we're not activating through this trust for women's ordination. We're activating for women to get employed and to flourish, and to have it be very obvious that everyone from the division president down is cheering them on. And that's where we've got to in 2020. So the ordination thing is a matter of grief and misery to me. It happened at San Antonio. It goes on with silly shenanigans at annual councils about compliance. But I'm just telling you that in Australia, even in Papua New Guinea, there are scores and scores of women pastors. Some of them having a bit of a hard time, but at least the infrastructure is in place. A bunch of them came to our conference in February and just blessed us, and we blessed them. So that's the kind of thing that makes me optimistic and not too stressed about Ted's crazy annual council compliance votes. Because on the ground, the women are being supported, they're being encouraged. I would love to see them being ordained, but that's a different hat that I wear to the hat for the Women in Ministry Trust, which wants them to flourish.
Do you think that if Ted Wilson gets back in, or people that support his views, and the SPD is told to shut down this kind of thing, what do you think they'll do?
I don't think anyone is going to tell anyone to stop hiring women as pastors. There are plenty of right-wing activists that would like to do that. Even at the TOSC Theological Study Conference that met over 4 years, which, by the way, came out with a majority opinion in favour of ordaining women that Ted resisted and politicked to not even bring to the table at San Antonio. That's another story. But anyway, at that conference, I had women friends who were on the committee. And one of them told me about one of the activists on the right-wing side who said to her, look, don't worry if you lose one job, because by the time this is all done, we're going to make sure that women aren't employed as pastors. But listen, don't worry, we're going to get the General Conference to have a fund to retrain the women pastors so they can give them another job. So there was plenty of that sentiment in that TOS committee. But remember, the TOS committee came out in favour of women being ordained and said there was no theological objection.
Yeah.
So I don't think anybody is going to crusade for women not to be past. No church leader would dare go there.
Oh, certainly not. I don't think even Ted would say that women can't be pastors, but I'm meaning if the kibosh comes on. Well, I mean, as far as I know, our division hasn't ordained any women.
No. I
But
wish
Norway,
they had, because
Norway has.
Hmm?
Norway has, and California, is that some?
California has, and Columbia Union has. I don't know if any of the Europeans have. They've just they've done the clever thing, and they've just said we're going to have a service that works for both genders, but we're not going to call it ordination.
Yeah.
Therefore, we're not going to break the rules.
But Ted spoke about that and said that was they couldn't.
Well, that's why he disciplined them.
That's right, and they can't do that in future. So that's what I'm saying. In this future, where he chats to them again and they report back, what are they going to do?
Look, Europe is the home of the Protestant Reformation, Peter, and those Adventist leaders in Europe have my absolute admiration.
Oh, look, 100%
and
agree.
They're not going to be rolled. I don't think we need to lose too much sleep.
I can't wait for the fireworks on that one. And again, just to highlight this, whenever I've been involved with helping support anyone in ministry and the equality of anyone in ministry, regardless of gender, people often talk about you, that your name comes up within a few paragraphs, a few sentences, because people have appreciated all that you've done.
Well, that's good. That's encouraging. I hope I don't come up as a pariah.
No, definitely not. With back to Glacier View and Des Ford, was an injustice done to him, do you think?
I think so.
Do you think it was really interesting listening to John Rosier's interview the other night? He spoke about how he felt when he heard Des talk about the gospel and righteousness by faith, and as he started recounting this, and not only recounting the memories of Des, but actually recounting the message that Des shared, you could just feel this presence of love, and I got goosebumps just hearing him talk about it.
Yeah.
And you've heard Des talk about the gospel and speak on the gospel many times. Can you share a bit about your feelings on how he moved you with his words and thoughts on the gospel?
Yeah, I never forget when I first went to Avondale in 1966. The first class we did was Daniel and Revelation. There were 4 Des classes that we got over, and the first was Daniel and Revelation. The second was Life and Teachings of Jesus, and the third was Introduction to Theology, and the final one was Systematic Theology. So our whole theological trajectory, that's compared to biblical studies, that was Jorgi and Salem and others, but the theological strand was Des. I remember getting into the Daniel and Revelation class, and I would write to mum and dad. I think they were in West Australia. So I'd write to them every week, sometimes a couple of times, and I would do a summary of where we got to in Des's
Oh,
class this week.
oh wow.
Um,
Do they,
it,
is those letters, are those letters still around?
I don't think so,
That'd be an interesting document.
but they really would. I was just thinking about that the other day, but it was riveting in terms of focusing us as students on the real central core of what it meant to be a Christian. I never got the feeling that, even with my close personal friendship with Des, that I was just some naive what's the word for people when they follow musos? What do you call a groupie?
Groupie, yeah.
I never thought I was just some Des Ford groupie.
A Fordite.
No, I hated those designations.
Mm.
I always had the feeling of belonging to this networked family. That's who we were at Avondale, the faculty and the students. That there was something, we were all in it together, and it had phenomenal power at its core that was motivating us and pushing us along in a trajectory, a vision for ministry and service. And Des contributed a huge amount to that. But I never got the feeling he was looking for groupies or cultivating us as groupies.
I had the pleasure of meeting him when he did those 2 programs for me, and you helped out with the meeting as well we had at church. You did a wonderful call and response thing there, where you and just got a mental blank.
Was it Marion?
No. I've got a mental blank. You both did a call response. Anyway, I'll remember in a minute. And it was just very moving, and you could see the passion because there was over 350 people turned up that morning, and in the afternoon 330 people for the Q&A with him. And in talking to him and doing an SDA Q&A podcast, my first 3 were with him. I never ever got that sense that he was in any way trying to be, or even considered that he was a rock star of the Adventist.
No.
A very humble man and beautiful insights, and often spoke highly of his detractors as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I would agree, a real loss. And a few people have said in the interviews that imagine what the church would have looked like. You said that the church was possibly going to be a lame horse or limping horse ever since Glacier View, or potentially could be.
Yeah.
Imagine if Glacier View hadn't turned out the way it did. What do you think the church would be now, with Des Ford as a...
It's a really interesting thing. Because I think because we're only humans, and humans are frail, and humans tend to think in predictable ways. Good studies of sociology and psychology can predict the ways even that people behave in community, and religious communities especially, and especially more so when there is a corpus of sacred venerated texts. When people get together and forge an identity that really makes those texts and their interpretation a central issue of being a true believer or truly belonging, it's a risky operation. Christians grew in the first 300 years without a New Testament in their back pocket. So you don't need a New Testament in your back pocket to be a phenomenally committed Christian on tiptoe waiting for Jesus to come back again.
Mm.
And I think that's the thing with Ellen White too. Both with the Bible and with Ellen White, we have to be willing to hold the sacred, revered text in a very careful grasp, because you grip it too tight, you actually crush it.
Mm.
If you try and make it say and do things it never could do. So it's really important for any dynamic Christian movement to be able to express what is its core without saying there's got to be a compliance document to make sure the core is never damaged in any way.
Mm.
Ellen White said, the Bible can take plenty of... truth can afford to be fair. I'm paraphrasing, but
Yeah,
we can have a good
scrutiny.
Yeah, we can have plenty of conversations about these sacred texts that are important to us, but we shouldn't crush them by demanding more of them or use them as hammers to bang each other over the head.
Do you think this is the mistake that perhaps, and there's many that would consider it not a mistake, but Parmenter and Tolhurst, out of their desire to see the church not be torn asunder, their motives were possibly quite good, but did they take this kind of idea that you're talking about?
I think it's a
crush and control.
Yeah.
I'm not wanting to put anybody down. That's the thing.
No.
I respect the time frame they were in, the pressure they were under, the desire to protect their church. I loved Norm Young's story about when Athol moved up this way, that they would have meals together and walk together. But there was some definite attempts to crush and control the young ministers of the early 80s.
Yeah, yeah.
What did you ever talk to Parmenter and Tolhurst in that period?
Yes, I remember while I was at Fulton coming back on furlough and going to a ministers' meeting that Athol was chairing in North New South Wales. It felt quite dynamic to me. The conversation was about righteousness by faith. We hadn't got to the big Glacier View bombshell era quite yet.
Right.
But even so, the righteousness by faith thing was really stirring.
Mm.
And Athol chaired a pretty good-natured free-for-all where everybody got a say. And I was only this ring in from Fulton, but I remember getting a say, and it felt that was my personal experience would have to say that Athol ran a genial and good-natured shop.
Mm.
I know that in pursuing his desire to keep the church on track, that there were some very tough times, and some of my colleagues experienced some tough times. But that one experience was a good one.
Did you speak to him or Parmenter in the early 80s after Glacier View?
No. After Glacier View, I got to Avondale. It may have been that Athol was a bit apprehensive about that appointment, but soon after that, he went to the GC. No, look, I think he was at the division for a year or two while I was pastor there, but we never had occasion to have any talks, and he certainly never came after me in any kind of administrative way at all.
Where, at that time when many young Adventist ministers left the church, many that you would have probably known at the time or went to college with, did they reach out to you? Did you have conversations with them at all post Glacier View?
Yes. Too many to even be able to quantify or specify. Yeah. It was like a long drawn out version of the photocopy frenzy in the sand.
Yeah.
It went on for, for some time.
What was the gist of some of the things that
Oh,
were saying?
laments, and the Aussie framework, the way we relate and so on, has got this fairly earthy, cynical edge to it sometimes. And sometimes conversations were more about imagining motives and so on than being able to clearly discuss issues. So I think probably there was a little bit of the conversations were a mixture of personal pain, cynicism, intrigue, motives ascribing, but not totally. I think the Australian colleagues that I've had have been really theologically insightful. So there was an awful lot of theology that got a very good looking over, and caused a fair bit of frustration because the church wasn't always coming along at the same rate that those theological conversations were.
Actually, I'm chatting tomorrow at I think 2 o'clock. Yeah, 2 o'clock with Harry Ballas.
Oh,
So
fantastic.
that's going to be an interesting
Yeah,
discussion
yeah,
about that very thing. You
yeah.
know how you've set up. You were talking about the independent ministry to women, for want of a better term, um, to help their plight. Was there anyone at the time in the early '80s that set up anything independently, but from the home base of the Adventist Church, but independently run to support a lot of these ministers that left in a similar way that you have with women?
Oh, look, I don't know. I know that many of my colleagues were in grief about what was occurring. I do know that Jim Cox was out here as president of the college for 3 years after Glacier View, and Jim did Jim and Ian Giller and Norm Young, and I don't know, I can't think of any others from the college faculty. They did an awful lot of globetrotting around Australia and the Pacific, trying, and that was a shocking assignment when you think about it, because they were all severely traumatized by trying to be loyal to a church organizational structure, and at the same time encourage particularly young pastors who they met, many in the process of evaporating away, and trying to encourage them to stay. I never got that task, but my hat goes off to anyone who tried that. And Jim Cox and Norm and Alwyn Salem and Ian Giller did it to their eternal credit. I think they may have actually saved a few people and encouraged a few to stay the course. I don't know how you'd quantify that.
It's a pity there wasn't some kind of group they could have joined. These days there would have. And Gordon Hammond, who I chatted to the other day, he has a Facebook group called Beyond Glacier View. If he's watching, please put the link in, because I may have got that wrong. And he's trying to address making contact with a lot of people that suffered during that era. Just one or two quick more things, and if I'd be interested, if you didn't mind, if I just opened up. There's a few questions. I look down, not because I'm not listening to you, but occasionally some questions pop up on the screen, and since I've got this, I'm trying to interact a little bit with people that are writing. But Ellen White said a few times that the Lord would have returned if the Adventist Church if the Adventist Church had stayed on course and taught the three angels' message as they should have, which implies that there's a work to do and that can be done that would hasten the return of Christ. With that in mind, what's your opinion of the last generation theology that seems to be quite popular today?
Yeah. All of that whole ethos of communication, like that you've quoted from Ellen White, is what you expect from prophetic voices in a spiritual community. It's like, it's not necessarily getting out the whip and cracking it, but it's I've got a vision for the future. I want to draw you toward the vision. Exhortation, that's that sort of thing. And I think that's the nature of spiritual leadership. Some people do it in an inspiring way. Some people do it less than effectively. So I think we ought to expect in a spiritual community leaders who admonish, nurture, encourage, and energize us toward the future. The symbols they use and the language they use shouldn't be open to micro-analysis. Otherwise, you get to the silly position they did with that Ellen White stuff, where they were figuring out on the calendar who's still left, who was in a meeting where she said stuff.
For worms, yeah.
You see, it's forcing her beyond what you should ask of a prophet.
But if she felt that the message needs to be told to all the world, and if the church had done that, and if they'd been living, being more prepared, that's a pretty general thrust of her message.
I don't think her thrust was be perfect before Jesus returns. Was it? I don't think that's an Ellen White.
She never says that we can be perfect on our own bat, but through Jesus we can. One of Raglan's last statements in his
when the character of Christ shall be fully reproduced in his people. That's ministry of healing, is it? Or Christ's object lessons.
He was saying that the various colleges, Avondale, Longburn, Lilydale, to stay true to the SDA faith, all the faculty and board members must sign without mental reservation a statement of commitment to our foundational beliefs. And one of them he lists, to be accepted, they should also specifically reject the New Age theology teaching that we cannot overcome sin, even if spirit-filled, and that we shall continue to live in sin until Jesus comes. So I don't think they're getting these ideas from a vacuum and just getting it wrong. I think Ellen White was saying we've got to be ready. To be ready, we've got to keep the commandments. Keeping the commandments is making the Sabbath a test. And there's going to come a time where you have to stand before the Lord sinless. And you can only do that by allowing Christ into your heart, and then he will help make that happen. You don't think that's what they were thinking?
Oh, I think there's big strands of Adventism that have thought that.
Yeah. They didn't get it from Ellen White?
Oh, they got it from her and the porridge and the wheat bix and the lentil soup that everybody was drinking. Yeah. I don't want to sheet all of our misapprehensions home to Ellen White, because it's in the eye of the beholder as much as the proclaimer. And I really want to see her more as an admonishing proclaimer than as a sort of a codifier of fine print doctrine. So back to your question about last generation theology, I don't buy it. I think it's appalling in the fact that it does despite to the gospel. The New Testament picture of the imminence of Christ's coming does talk about, like in Peter, you read this, 1st and 2nd Peter, don't you? Hastening unto, looking forward to the day, what kind of persons ought we to be? That's dynamic spiritual admonition, good leadership style. But it's not making proclamations about theological I just can't find the word I'm looking for. It's not making stipulations about theological constructs to do with our personal lives. The gospel deals with all of those.
Exactly. And that then begs the question, what happened? Why did we need the investigative judgment if that's all fairly clearly stated already in the Gospels?
Yeah.
So what do you think happened as the midnight hour clicked over to October 23, 1844?
It clicked over to the next morning, the next second. I'm not going to buy into, I think William Miller's maths are not the kind of thing that are central to me about what it means to be an apocalyptic Adventist.
That's what Norm Young said, and Bill Johnson as well. I struggle to find someone that will agree on my show so far that Ellen White's Great Controversy version of the investigative judgment is accurate. And then when I say, so you're saying we need to lead a sinless life before Christ returns so you can be saved, they say, well, you don't really understand the word sinless. And then you get onto another tangent, and I'm trying to get, if there's such a big problem that grew to Glacier's view and the issues on 1844 and the investigative judgment, if there is such a big problem, why can't I find a definition of what was before and what Des was opposed to and what the church believes now? It's like impossible to find it.
It's a slippery thing. You can't grasp it and hold it in your hand.
Yet it's the central pillar of Adventism.
Not my Adventism, Peter.
No. So is your Adventism different to her Adventism? Not in the big picture. When you look around at the world we live in, at atheism, secularism, materialism, and a bunch of other religious isms, Ellen White and I live in the same room. But the room's not got all walls the same coloured paint, and there's a diversity of furniture in the room. But it's a very nice room to be in, and I'll concede, because I was born into the room, it makes it even nicer for me. I didn't choose really to be in the room, but the room works for me. Do you think you would have chosen the room as an adult now?
It's a good question. I've sometimes thought about that, but it's impossible to answer.
So I may never get to the point of fully understanding what the investigative judgment actually is.
I think you grew up knowing enough about it to know what it was, didn't you?
Everyone denies that they ever taught that.
Do they?
Yeah. Like there'll be people that say, yeah, they taught that and I don't believe that. And there'll be people that say, that was taught, but you're misunderstanding sin, you're misunderstanding what Ellen White really meant, you're misunderstanding the context. Well, I think it's pretty black and white what Raglan said there, that that's one of the things they hated about the Questions on Doctrine book, because it changed the Adventist stance on the nature of Christ. So therefore it gave them hope that prior to that, they felt that because Christ lived a sinless life, that's what we're supposed to do as well. But it's impossible to find anyone that
can't interview Uriah Smith. I'd love to. He must have been a fantastic character.
They all were fascinating. Absolutely, you cannot look at Adventist history and get bored. It is fascinating.
I'll tell you one thing that I absolutely love, Peter. A couple of years ago, I went to Loma Linda, and Gil Valentine, my very dear friend, took me for a trip around Loma Linda to something that was new since I'd been there last. And that was, there's a Brazilian sculptor, I don't know his name, he's done some very impressive castings and sculpture pieces. I think he did the ones in the GC foyer, which are really beautiful.
Oh, yes, I've seen those.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, he did a piece and it sits up on top of the hill at Loma Linda, and it's Ellen White with Willie, her son, is there, and someone called Burden, who was a church leader, maybe a California conference president. But it's a reenacting of them traipsing around looking for the site for this medical school that Ellen's got a vision for building and getting into action to make physicians to carry forward Adventist mission. And there's a horse and cart, and there's Ellen White, and the characters are all life size.
Mm.
And Ellen White is she's a little mama. She's like in my spirit and in my imagination, she's this massively imposing figure that you sometimes want to sort of butt against, and other times you're overwhelmed and almost cowed and in awe of. But here on top of the hill, she's a little grandma. She's got a gleam in her eyes. She's got a vision for what needs to be done. And you look out past her and you see this massive campus and the fantastic development that's occurred there as a result of the leadership and energy. And she put some of her own money into it. And the text talks about, it quotes her from a conversation she had with those three on top of the hill. And it was a deeply moving moment for me. Mm. And I think it was moving because it was pragmatic. It illustrated the thing that she must best be remembered for, which is to lead a scraggly movement of bushwhacking Midwesterners, some of them pretty crazy, and forge them into a movement that's actually circled the world and been a pathfinder in so many areas of human life and existence. But she was just a little grandma. There she is. You can go see her there today. And that was very powerful to me in cementing the fact that I love being in this room, but this room is made up of real human beings, and some of them are actually shorter than me, and I'm not all that tall.
Yeah, I think I've read some of her transcribed sermons where they've been unedited. Fanny Bolton and Marion Davis didn't get anywhere near
Never got to them, yeah.
And there's a passion and power that comes through. She would have been a very interesting woman to meet.
Yeah.
I think no less interesting or important, though, do you think, than many, many other women that have forged similar paths?
Yeah, sure.
Boy, I could talk to you for hours, Lyall, and I think sometimes we do. Your granddaughter and my daughter are the same age, and
that's right.
They were best friends, in fact,
yeah.
until your mob moved away to Queensland. Yeah. So we'll catch up again in the park.
Yes, next time the little girls need someone to push the swing, Peter.
Or have a veggie burger in the local takeaway. But before we go, just a couple of quick things. I'll just look through if that's okay. And look, I was just glancing at, there's lots of comments, and I'd love you to kind of dive in at your leisure if there's been any questions. Sometimes it gets a bit robust and crazy down there in the comments. Just ignore anything that's disturbing, block people that you don't want to engage with. But so I'm just going to quickly just look down through Lyell Heise's parents were great mentors to me during my time at Memorial. People are writing often to things we've said, so I don't know what they've gone wonderful. I don't know what that was. Too. You got to kind of watch it live, and you'll see the comments come up. Someone has asked, can you ask Lyall about the release of the Baker letter, which he secured from the White estate?
Oh, yes. Look, just quickly, I can do that. I was at the seminary, and the issue of the nature of Christ, what was the era, 73 to 75.
Mm.
So there's a ferment, and it was mostly good. There was lots of interest, some opinions beginning to harden. And I was doing I forget what the subject was. I can't remember whether it was church history or whether it was a theology subject. But anyway, the Baker letter describes a letter that Ellen White wrote to an American who was a pastor in Australia in the late 1890s. And Baker had come out here to be a preacher and an evangelist. And Waggoner was out here as well for some of that time.
Oh,
He was
right.
following up, not Waggoner, Prescott. Prescott was out here, and Prescott was a great preacher of the gospel and a great supporter of the Waggoner and Jones 1888
Yes.
business. And Gill's got a whole book on Prescott.
Yes, I've actually started reading that.
So Prescott and Baker were out here, and Prescott was a bit inclined to talk about Jesus as with a sinful nature, the kind of pre-questions on doctrine emphasis that plays into, sometimes can play into, well, if Jesus overcame sin with a sinful nature, you can too, and how you're getting on. And Baker was traveling around a bit with Prescott, running missions here and there. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, because this always looks like out of the blue, we never get to see the other side of the conversation.
Yeah.
But here comes Ellen White saying to Baker, who's been traipsing around preaching with Prescott in Tasmania and Victoria and here and there. And I'm got to use my memory, and it's only a paraphrase, but it's stuff like, be careful, very careful, how you present the human nature of Christ. Do not present him as one with propensities to sin.
Mm.
Here she comes, and this is the one that Questions on Doctrine editors loved, because it enabled them to present an Ellen White to Martin and Barnhouse that was an Ellen White with a view of Jesus that was quite congenial to them as evangelicals.
Mm.
So all I did was find all the statements, recreate some Baker territory. I went to go and get the statements released. In those days, to quote a statement in an academic paper, you had to get it released by the White Estate.
Right.
And that was usually a matter of course. They weren't difficult to get on with.
Right.
But they wouldn't release things that named people, or they got sensitive about people that still had a family network alive if something was a bit. So it was a useful, it was like they were gatekeepers in that respect.
Mm.
But I never felt they were theological gatekeepers.
No.
So they released these, and I quoted them and published this paper. I didn't publish it. I presented it as a course at Andrews University. And in it, I made the point that it seemed to me that Ellen White, in that Australian context, was saying to Baker, and maybe implying even to Prescott, now come on, boys, we can't push this sinful nature of Jesus as far as you're pushing it. That's my interpretation. So she says, so be careful, very careful how you do this.
Right.
My antagonists, who included Herbert Douglas and a few others who read my paper, said, oh, come on, Lyall, that's a big push. If Ellen White wanted to correct Prescott, why didn't she just write to him? And that's a fair point. But I was saying, I'd traced, what's his name? My fellow, I forget his name. Baker. I'd traced him around and knew that he was working with Prescott. And I wasn't trying to say Ellen was too scared to tell Prescott. She just heard Baker, so she got to work and said, now just be careful about this. And I wanted to make the point that maybe in our present conversation, if she was around, she might be trying to say, go easy on this, folks. Because you can find statements by her that look the other way too.
Yeah.
She's got what somebody called a wax nose on this one. It's a little bit of this and a bit of that.
Yeah.
But that was a vignette from Australia in the late 1890s that I got hold of anyway.
Someone's commented on the by saying about the fundamentals being a bit vague, and if you read the fundamental on this judgment issue as of now, I think it says Jesus' ultimate sacrifice gives us confidence to approach God. Tick. Knowing we are forgiven. Tick. Now Jesus is reviewing our lives before returning, so there's no question that his judgments are made in love. And to me, and they've said, does this seem a little ambiguous?
Oh, okay. That's in statement
one of the
24,
fundamentals,
is it?
Yeah. Now, my thought is that when you just slot in, now Jesus is reviewing our lives before returning, so there's no question that his judgments are made in love. Hang on, go back a bit. Now he's reviewing our lives. What does that mean? And that's what I'm talking about when the fundamentals tend to gloss over. I don't mind when the fundamentals are made more evangelical or Christ-centered, and I think they've picked up on what I was trying to say. But they're trying to kind of word things in a way that can be taken two ways, and they're being a bit sneaky, I think.
Okay.
But this person has said, does this seem a little ambiguous, which is a better word than sneaky?
Yeah, it does seem ambiguous in that context, but the way that I think Des would have wanted to argue at Glacier View was that the idea of a pre-Advent judgment that Des always said he understood and affirmed is this idea of the great controversy, that there's more beings in the universe interested in this. There is a big controversy, and we're going to be very clear about how God has been just, is just, and it's not that we're getting a workover, but that is God proclaiming evidence of his justness in his handling of the great controversy. And that's about where Des was at when I last heard him in the Adventist context talk about this. And I think he would have been happier if they'd said that in Fundamental 24. I think he could live with Fundamental 24, but it probably was a little bit of an itch under the leg of his jeans that he would need to scratch.
What do you think he thought should have been added?
Oh, I think he would prefer to say that a pre-Advent judgment is a proclamation to the universe of God's justice.
Right.
It's not rehashing to see whether we did the right thing or whether Joe Blow has any unforgiven sins.
Right. Here's another interesting question. 1844 was also very important in preaching the imminent return of Christ. This has been the main thrust of evangelists in every generation since. Should this still be the main focus of SDA teaching?
Oh, yeah, I think so. And that's what I mean by an apocalyptic, what's the word? The orientation. The apocalyptic orientation is that way. Now, you can go to the extremes and start setting dates and creating disappointments and creating massive disillusionment. But the orientation of every Christian from post-resurrection Sunday onwards is this standing on tiptoe waiting for the conclusion of the great controversy. And that's ambiguous too, I freely grant you, but I don't think you proclaim Christianity authentically unless it's a message of hope. And hope, to be quite honest, the coming of Jesus is no further away than the longest human being's lifetime. And that's a lot less than the time since 1844. So the coming of Jesus is not too far away for me, Peter. A little bit further away for you,
Not much.
but the
That
orientation.
wasn't Adventism, though, wasn't it? Adventism's not talking about
No,
the small amount of time we've been on the earth and the closeness we are to death. It's talking about a specific, whoa, hang on, get ready for the ride of your
yeah,
life, because he didn't come back last night, but he is coming back so soon,
I know.
in fact, that there'll be no more children born, people won't
Yep.
be dying, it's
Well,
going to
that's
come to
the
judge the living.
extremity of it, where it becomes ridiculous.
But that's the extreme. That's wasn't the extremity. That was the teaching.
But to the extremity of what I call the apocalyptic ambience of genuine New Testament Christianity. It's an extreme version of it.
But if you were there in the months after 1844 and you were part of that band of Advent believers and believed the cornfield,
Yeah,
Crozier spoke of that, but was it
Hiram Edson.
Hiram Edson? Yeah. Um, would you have been swept
Yes,
up in
yes,
that?
I would have been. But look, here's the genius of Adventism. The same Adventism that comes out of the cornfield and creates things that maybe embarrass a reader of history now, that same Adventism has this gutsy little woman with her horse and cart producing medical schools, making massive institutions, unfolding grand visions of an approach to worldwide evangelism that requires publications and institutions and hospitals.
But Mormonism does that too. So do many other faiths.
Yeah, I'm only bringing that up. No, I'm not bringing that up to grandstand, but just to say it's possible in an apocalyptically oriented movement to juggle these things in both hands. To know that history has a destination, that Jesus is coming back, he's coming back soon, but by gum, we're going to defeat the evil alcohol, we're going to knock slavery on the head, we're going to train doctors, we're going to send missionaries to the uttermost parts of the earth.
But that doesn't that just mean that's the call that Jesus imprinted into people? I'm trying to work out what was
Yeah,
special about 1844, other than it created providentially a movement of people that have done all these things you're talking about.
that's exactly what you said, took the words out of my mouth.
At that point, when you were there, post Cornfield vision or inspiring revelation that Hiram had, you would have been on board if you were immortal and you kept on living from that time to now. At what point would you have lost your thoughts that it was that imminent, that apocalyptic?
Probably about the same time William Miller did. He did it in the late 1840s. You remember that? It's a poignant phrase. I have fixed my view on another day.
Yeah.
And that day is today and every day until he comes. And I think William Miller got the maths out of his system.
He did, and he left the movements that were involved with having not got it out of their system. Would you have left Adventism earlier on if you'd discovered that only months later or a couple of years later?
Oh, I don't know, Peter. I couldn't tell you. I'm too far gone a son of from this vantage point. I have to say no. I wouldn't have left. There's a song that rings in my spirit to this very day. Annie Smith wrote it. She was Uriah's sister, and it's that song called "How Far From Home." Do you remember that song? How far from home, I asked as on I bent my steps. The watchman spake, the long dark night is almost gone. The morning soon will break. Then weep no more, but haste thy flight with heaven's bright star, thy guiding ray, till thou shalt reach the realms of light in everlasting day. And she wrote that in about 1850. And I never forget hearing it at Andrews University, a phenomenal choir arrangement of
Mm,
that song. And it absolutely gets me at the very core of my being every time I sing it,
mm,
because it's the essence of this tension,
mm.
and it's still just as true and just as emotionally and spiritually engaging of me in 2020 as it was, I think, when Annie Smith wrote it in 1850.
Because it enhances that feeling of longing we all have within
Yeah,
us.
yeah.
Does truth matter though? Like if nothing actually happened that night and they got it wrong, but good stuff came out of it, and we're in a room that was built by appropriated wood and materials, is the people in the room that matter, it doesn't really matter how we got there?
Um,
For example, if I was a Mormon and I suddenly found out about um, the book of Abraham now with so much evidence confirming that it was a fake,
yes.
I would have trouble staying in the wonderful room of Mormonism based on that lie, based on that, not a lie that was well, he was intentional, but I don't think Ellen White was an intentionally lying person. But does truth matter as long as we've got a nice room?
Yeah, it does. But the fact is that we're all fragile human beings, and when we start to make exclusive claims that we've got everything sewn up and together in a package, I think we create a community that I'm not going to be able to survive in.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Hey, that's probably a really good note to leave it on because that is so true. It's about we resist the control, and people are at different paths, points of different paths,
Yeah, yeah.
and the togetherness is important. Hanging out with you over a burger is something I'm looking forward to. Um, I'd like to invite people to join me on Friday nights. We have what I'm calling campfire songs, and I just sing all the old gospel
Oh,
songs. You
yeah.
should
Hey,
send me the
Pete,
words. Send me the words to that hymn, and I'll sing it.
yeah, I love that. Hey, listen, I'll go one better. I've started at 2 o'clock Sabbath afternoon. Choose your favorite hymns.
Oh, that's
So,
fantastic. Yeah.
so I love yours. I tune in on yours. And what I should do on Sabbath afternoon, I should bring out that hymn and play it. So
Yes.
just look me up on Facebook
Yeah.
Live at 2 o'clock Sabbath afternoon.
Yeah. Well, people have got your link here, and we've grown. This group has grown from 220 members to 730 in just 3 weeks. So there's a
Serious.
real, yeah. So there's an interest in this debate and this conversation. But I want to just highlight that my aim is to bring healing, uh, put the spotlight on anything, and truth will survive. It can cope with scrutiny. But at the end of the day, it's the singing, the times of devotion, breaking bread together, to me, that are the most important things.
Indeed.
There's some nice comments people have made towards you there on the post. I won't read them. I'll let you go back yourself and find them.
Hmm.
And I just want to say thanks for being a part of my room. And even though I'm not in that room, my room's you've got these screen doors on your room that allow
Yeah,
me to still participate. I think
excellent.
I've said this story before, but a friend of mine that actually works at the North American division, and he wrote when I officially left the church, he said to me, oh, "I'm going to really miss you, bro. It's yeah, really sad. All the best with your life." And I wrote back, "Dude, I'm still here. I'm not dead."
Yes.
And so I just really appreciate your friendship, the many people that have maintained their friendships with me, and the ability to still commune with the many wonderful things that are the culture and subculture of Adventism.
Hmm.
So thank you very much, Lyle, for being here
Okay.
today, and
Love being with you, Peter.
it's been fantastic. If everyone's enjoyed it that have stayed through, and we've had at least 25 people have stayed right through the whole time, which is
Oh my
great.
goodness, they're tigers for punishment.
And usually there's 100 or more that watch during the week as well. So send those love hearts up now to show Lyle how much we appreciate him. And tomorrow, as I said, we've got 2 o'clock Harry Ballas, which will be a very interesting conversation as well. And
Excellent. I'll be there.
hopefully we're creating a nice resource of the thoughts on Glacier View and all things Adventist. Thanks, Lyall.
Okay. All the best.
Wow, there we go. Incredible. We're back to 2025 now. Those listening on the podcast, season 2. And if you want to watch that on YouTube, it's now season 13, and that was episode 26. But we are rewatching season 2, and that was episode 10. And I've got so many things to say that I can't even say more about it. I'll perhaps leave it there. But when folk like Lyell say that's not my Adventism, I'm starting to really understand that, because when I talk to Adventists that say that to me, they don't like it if I try and define their Adventism. But I've noticed that all those who say that's not my Adventism have similar beliefs. So there's the type of Adventism that I grew up in that is represented right there in that interview with Dr. Lyell Heise. And then there's this kind of traditional, original Adventism. And I was quite impressed with my questions. I have memories of that season being all over the place, but I, in fact, stand by all those questions I asked. And I think in the 5 years since then, we've realized demonstrably that really there are two kinds of Adventists, generally speaking. There's those who say that's not my Adventism when we talk about Ted Wilson, etc. And there's those who really want to go back to their original traditional Adventism and support Ted Wilson. And there's lots of kinds of Adventists in between. But if you're one of those people that hear me talking about traditional Adventism and you say, hey, that's not my Adventism, then you are, in essence, defining a kind of Adventism that you belong to. And I believe that it's a viable one. It's the Lyell Heise kind of Adventism that he presented there, albeit 5 years ago. And I think that some of my fears for that group, the It's Not My Adventism, liberal progressive revisionist, big tent, gospel cultural, that's not my Adventism Adventists, I fear for you, because in some ways you are being marginalized, pushed down and suppressed. And very few people that have a liberal progressive revisionist cultural big tent gospel, that's not my Adventism kind of Adventism, you're not speaking up so much publicly those views. So it's refreshing to go back and listen to season 2, where a lot of retired Adventists were speaking up for the kind of Adventism they want, which is more biblically based, Bible based, gospel based, Ellen White in the back seat kind of thing. I would have asked Lyall a question, though, about these kinds of Adventism that he is not, that he doesn't want anyone to define him in his Adventism, and you guys that all fall into that, you don't want to be defined, and you just want to say that, well, that's not me, that's not mine. I forgot what I was going to say. That kind of Adventism is slipping away, I believe, and you need to do something about it if you want it to really shine. But it's a pleasure hearing Lyell Heise's version and the many people that I've interviewed in season 2, because it's a very unique kind of Adventism. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I wanted to say to Lyell, though, that Adventism that you don't agree with was sanctioned in vision by Ellen G. White. And although she changed and grew and perhaps got closer to a better gospel understanding by the time she died, the pillars of Adventism were still firmly in place. And all of those pillars at one time or another were sanctioned and validated by visions where she claimed God had told her. So if you go, well, look, that's more of a Uriah Smith kind of Adventism, I don't buy into that. Or, hey, Ellen White's not going to be in charge of the theology of Adventism. Okay, that's good. But where do you take the concept? Where do you process this concept and still keep Ellen in play with your gospel Adventism if she is making these claims supported by God in vision that you don't believe anymore? I don't know if I'm making sense, but if you're saying, I don't believe in that Uriah Smith kind of investigative judgment view, I believe that theology and Adventism can move on and we can formulate new theology. How do you explain then that Ellen confirmed the Uriah Smith kind of sanctuary doctrine in vision, that God told her that this is a unique people with the spirit of prophecy? Yes, so anyway, they're my thoughts, and great to have you guys watching. Tomorrow I will be doing another season 2 rewatch. It's the Harry Ballas one, and it's the only one I had to put the little, what do they call it, an E for explicit. It's a couple of swear words, so bring your earplugs and I'll try and have a little beeper button for you. No, you're all grown up. I'll just have a quick look at some comments here. Oh, thank you. Stephen has said that I'm kind to my guests. I appreciate that. Moto Sapiens says the Jesus of the SBC. What's the SBC? Isn't the Jesus that they know. So what do they do with this? John Kaler has said he's rejecting SDA doctrines in massive rationalizations to make peace with dissonance. One cannot reject children of Hiram's cornfield. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. I would love to see the people who say this is not my Adventism and the ones that have this better liberal, progressive, revisionist, cornfield, gospel, big tent, cultural, not my Adventists. I'd love them to say, hey, we love this Adventism we've got. And it's not what you traditional original Adventists have, not what you official Adventists have, what the official statement is. I'd love them just to claim it instead of trying to justify and rationalize the two together. It's different. It's good. It's a new theology. And the reality is Ellen White confirmed in vision and validated all of the old stuff you no longer agree with anyway. So where do you place her? And Moto Sapien says there are a few things he said 5 years ago that seem to be different than today. Do you think your position has changed since? I thought I sounded the same, but tell me where I'm different. My position has ebbed and flowed. I'm perhaps a little bit more feeling that the liberal, progressive, etc., Adventist is even more chalk and cheese than I've ever thought before. Whereas before I felt they could maybe live together and separately, and they probably still can. They will. They're going to keep doing this for the next 100 years for sure. But yeah, tell me where you think I've changed. And maybe I have. Angela, do you have birds on your shirt? Yes, they're little parrots, 2 little parrots on a branch, cuddling. This the best quote of the day. Malcolm says, "It's confusing because it's confusing." Yes, thank you. Yeah, good. Thanks. Motor Sapien is enjoying watching season 2. Me too. A lot of these I've not watched back for 5 years. And that comment was 2-part. Maybe YT shadowed the first. I wish, it's a regret. I wish I had gone live, not just into the private Facebook group with season 2. I know we're saying there's 25 watching and whatnot. There were people watching. We were getting over the course of an interview, 200 or 300 people watching just inside the Facebook group. 25 would watch the whole 2.5 hours. But the same as today, we're not much bigger, really. We had a huge growth, and then we've maintained that consistency for 5 years. That within 24 hours, there'd be over 1,000 views, and that's often the case now too. Yeah, I don't think it overshadowed, but I think it has meant that people who have watched post season 2 and are now looking back can see how really that should have been part of the conversation, and it was for people on Facebook who transitioned with me onto YouTube and Facebook together now. But I'm so excited. Yeah, it's a big regret that it's taken 5 years, but I'm so excited that season 2 is now getting out there to the general public, and I hope that it really continues to gain traction there. Motor Sapien adds, Peter, 5 years ago you said you didn't think Energy White was a liar. You've made clear that's not how you... I've never said she's a liar, and I don't think she's a liar. I certainly have never used those words in a sentence together, Ellen White and liar. Never. So, yeah, not sure where you got that one. I think she may have been deluded, duped, was a show person. I wouldn't say that if someone's doing a show night after night after night and they're putting on hey, we're going to go into vision now, and they're steering it a certain direction, I think she really believed it was happening and got herself caught up in it. But I think her and James were putting on a show, but I wouldn't call an artist doing a show night after night a liar just because they're having to redo. I often would sing night after night the same song and I would just find that place where it felt like the first time again for me. But there's certain parameters you have to fit in. There's a start of a show, an end of a show, and yeah. And I've never said she was a con artist. I do not view... so let's look at a 3-ring circus and the ringmaster, and he's putting a show on night after night, and there's certain tricks that he has to employ to get the audience on board. I would never say that person is a con artist. I would never say that they're a liar. I would say that someone might know what they're doing and they're putting on a show, and we all engage in that as the viewers. And so you're saying, isn't a con artist a liar? And yes, but I'm not saying she was a con artist or a liar. I'm saying that her and James put on a show. So when I put on a show with music years ago, I'd tour night after night. I remember touring Japan, and we did 21 gigs in 21 days, night after night, singing the same set. I was putting on a show, but I really believed in the content. And we had to employ certain magical tricks to get the audience, staying with us for the whole time. But it was certainly a genuine, authentic presentation. But if I felt a bit down one day, or it was a trade. I had to do the show. If I felt down, I'm not going to say to the audience, "Oh, look, guys, feeling really depressed or down. I'm not going to sing that song tonight," or doesn't, or you're recreating what you really believe in. And I think that she was doing that. I think if my take on it is different to Steve Daly's, I think she was a false prophet, but I don't think she thought she was a false prophet. I think that I would say there's a difference with someone saying something that is not true, but having cognitive dissonance in play, so they really do think it is true. So I wouldn't call a person like that dishonest. I would say they are duped. Remember my saying of the Adventist apologists? They're either deluded, disingenuous, duped, or dishonest. And I think Ellen White was the founder of Adventism, the original Adventist apologist. And I wouldn't say she was dishonest, but I think she was duped, and I think deluded. And I think at times she bordered on disingenuous behavior. Anyway, we're having a little side conversation there, Motor Sapien, as always. Thank you for watching, everyone. I'm looking forward to the Harry Ballas conversation tomorrow. He wrote the book, or put together the book. I've got a copy here. I've just forgotten the title, but he interviewed at least 40 or 50 Adventist pastors in the early 80s and talked about this experience that they'd just gone through after Glacier View. So this interview is a fascinating one, and he's all fired up. So, and Angela writes, she knew she was fake and the visions were made up. Yeah, and I guess where I'm at is I'm on the edge of either side of that. So Motor Sapien, maybe ask me in 6 months and I will say in agreement with Angela that that she was fake and the visions were made up. I certainly 100% don't believe her visions were from God. Where I see someone as potentially not being fake while also having visions that are made up is that sometimes people can get so absorbed in their delusion that they do have delusions of grandeur and feel that they really are having visions, if that makes sense. We see you watch it, people that have power and it becomes even more of a footprint that they have, their influence, they can get these delusions of grandeur. But to someone with a sense of this deluded sense of grandeur, are they lying or are they just presenting a lie to us that they believe? I'm looking forward to growing more in my understanding, but I 100% don't believe she had visions from God, and I 100% believe she wasn't a prophet, and I believe she was a false prophet. I believe her visions were fake. But in my mind, the jury is still out with her sense of believing it. And it kind of doesn't matter, because some of you guys have put her well and truly off the bus or way in the back seat, and you've made your own kind of Adventism, like Lyall has, and it works and it's functional, and they love it. And my only criticism of them is they need to be bolder and stronger and more networked, or it's going to dissolve and disappear. Maybe that's a good thing. And those who truly believe Ellen White as being a prophet, I believe that they've been deluded. And many of them are disingenuous or duped and dishonest. And Moto Sapien says, thank you for taking time to clarify. Sometimes I see you nodding with guests like Steve, so it implies that you're in agreement. Yes, I often nod because I go, yeah, oh, wow, I hear what you're saying. I can understand why you're saying it. But an interviewer and an interviewee have a symbiotic moment that doesn't necessarily, like, I agree with all of the Steve Daly outcomes. I'm just speculating that maybe she did truly believe it. This is the deepest we've gotten into your own position in quite a while. Thanks for letting us in. Essentially, I don't really have any claims. Barry says, Ellen was a hypocrite because she got the health message in the 1860s and was eating pork, oysters, and other meats 30 years after the vision. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I tell you what, there are so many things about her that are hypocritical, disingenuous, and yeah, quite honestly, to be truthful, in motion, in real time, I I can see that show person in her, that famous person, that person that had influence, that person that got lost in her own hype. And I've seen and know lots of musicians, and that's kind of been my field of experience. And I've seen them get lost in that as well. And they believe their own hype. But then you talk to them in the real world, and I wouldn't call them dishonest or fake. It's like they're just so caught up in the moment when the lights are on. That's why I'm less black and white on it. But yeah, in the moment, I'm getting closer and closer, because there are people that 100% are ripping the audience off with lies. There's plenty of people that we've seen on the world platform that do that. And there's a lot of part of me that is just teetering on the edge of thinking, you know what, Ellen? Yeah, I think you were really becoming a kind of leader that maneuvered and wanted to get your way. There's a lot of, in my humble opinion, mental health issues with Ellen as well. And I'd be careful calling someone with great mental health issues dishonest. Look at me being all self-reflective on this. I'm very interested in your opinions, and I like the clarity of what Angela said. She knew she was fake and the visions were made up. And I'm perhaps heading that way. And that's a good point you've just made there. The BS artist doesn't care what the truth is, just how it can be manipulated for personal gain. Yeah, and I would just add to that the BS artist can have that other component of getting so absorbed in their delusion that they don't even realize what they're doing. They justify it so convincingly. And they can do amazing things, and they can be a nice person, but whichever way you slice it, I 100% don't believe that God ever spoke into her ear. I believe it's all in her mind, one way or the other. And what people do with that, whether they say they can make their Adventism work, knowing that, believing that, or not believing it, that certainly informed my narrative. Thank you, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow for the Harry Ballas conversation of 5 years ago. Take it easy.